Munich, a city known today for beer gardens, baroque palaces, and peaceful parks. But beneath its charming surface lies a complex and turbulent past. This was the city where Adolf Hitler rose to power and where the Nazi Party was born. Yet it was also a city of courageous resistance. Young students, lone saboteurs, and outspoken clergy who dared to stand against a dictatorship. Welcome to today's video. We are in Munich, the capital of Bavaria and an absolutely beautiful city of Germany. Just as many European cities, Munich also holds a dark past. Because Munich was actually the birthplace of National Socialism. It was here where the Nazis gained more and more power and started their movement. But in today's video, I don't only want to speak about the dark history of Munich. I want to speak about people that had the courage to actually stand up against the Nazis and speak up for the victims. I've created various videos about the World War II history already, and there were so many people that constantly commented that I shouldn't just call the Nazis Nazis, but Germans. And I believe this is simply wrong, because obviously Nazis were Germans, but not all Germans were Nazis. And I believe that today's video will make that very clear. Let's dive into the resistance movement here in Munich. Why Munich, you might wonder now? Well, because in the 1920s, the beer halls weren't only famous for drinking, they were also centers of political gatherings and speeches. It was exactly here, this modern square where nowadays you can find businesses, where there used to be the Bürgerbräukeller, a beer hall that became especially famous on November 8th in 1923. It was one of the crucial points where the Nazi movement started. Nowadays, there's only this little plaque that you can see there on the floor that reminds of the Bürgerbräukeller. But it doesn't only remind of the Bürgerbräukeller, it also reminds of a very important attack on Hitler. On November 8th, 1939, there was an attempted murder of Hitler here in the cellar. Johann Georg Elser tried to murder Adolf Hitler on November 8th, 1939, to finally put an end on the terrors of the Nazi regime. The attempted murder happened exactly here, in the Bürgerbräukeller. However, years before, on November 8, 1923, this beer hall became the location of the starting point of the Nazi movement. On that day, Hitler, as well as 600 further Nazi members, walked into this beer hall, trying their attempted coup, which later on became known as the beer hall coup. Hitler entered during a speech of a state commissioner. He took out his gun, fired it into the ceiling, and said that now the revolution has started. One day later, on November 9th of 1939, Hitler, as well as thousands of other Nazi members, started their walk from this beer cellar into the city center of Munich, attempting their coup and attempting to take over the government. But the putsch ended violently when the Nazis met the police here very close to the Federnhaus in the Residenzstraße, which is the street here behind me. At that moment, gunfire broke out and the putsch clearly failed. However, this place here, that is now hiding a little bit behind the scaffolds, became a Nazi shrine. There was even a monument there during the Third Reich that remembered those Nazis that died during the putsch attempt. Everybody that passed this street and the Nazis standing in front of the building were required to do the Nazi salute. But there was an alley that is hiding behind the building that was known as the Dodgers Alley. It was used by people who refused to do the Nazi salute to escape those Nazis here in front of the building. It's a small alley that is a little bit hidden, and this way they were still able to make their way past the shrine, but without having to do the Nazi salute. Nowadays, you can see some golden bricks on the floor that marks the path towards the Dodgers Alley. I really like this path, even though it seems a small gesture, it is a big sign for resisting to do something that does not align at all with your values. There was a small resistance of the German people that didn't agree at all with what the Nazis did. And this brings us to the heart of our story today. Right here at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, there was a non-violent resistance group formed by students and their professor in the early 1940s. It was known as the White Rose. The core members were students: Hans Scholl, his sister Sophie Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, Will Graf, and their philosophy professor Kurt Huber. Especially the story of Sophie Scholl is very interesting, as she, just like many other young people at that time, felt attracted by the Nazi movement in its early beginnings. At the age of 13, she even joined the Jungmädchen, which was a group of the Nazi youth. She and her brother Hans Scholl, as well as further siblings, were also members of the Nazi youth, as they were drawn towards the sense of community as well as the desire of a new Germany. However, things changed in 1937. There was this turning point for Sophie Scholl once her brother Hans got arrested by the Gestapo. He and other siblings had done things that did not align with the Nazi ideology. Even though Sophie only got arrested for a little time, the experience impacted her a lot. Later on, she wrote in her diary that she felt detached to the Nazi youth. They quickly realized the strong sense of community, the actions of the regime, as well as the restrictions on intellectual freedom did not align with their own values and critical thinking. In 1942, Sophie followed Hans to Munich to study there. Here, she joined a circle of friends, students that were reading forbidden literature and sharing ideas that did not align with the Nazi ideology. Some of those students, including Hans, Christoph, Willi, and others, were experiencing war on the Eastern Front as medics. They were telling the truth about what they saw, about the atrocities they witnessed, as well as the mass murder of Jews. Besides that, Sophie's boyfriend wrote her from the front line and talked about the crimes he witnessed on a daily basis. This only strengthened the opinion that the Nazis had to be opposed and stopped. Sophie and the members of the White Rose believed that if they would remain silent, this would only make them complicit. Their weapon was the truth. The White Rose started to print out leaflets and distribute them. They used a typewriter as well as a machine to make copies of the leaflets, and they distributed them in Munich, but also in other cities. Sophie Scholl was integral to that process because she was responsible for the logistics. She was getting the paper, the envelopes, as well as stamps, which at the time were rationed. She always tried to buy small quantities of stamps to get as many stamps as possible, and she bought them at several locations around the city. These snippets here that you can see on the floor in front of the Ludwig Maximilian University are original copies of those leaflets that were printed by the White Rose. You can find them here on the ground as a memory of what the White Rose did to tell the truth about the Nazis. In those leaflets, they started to publish the crimes that the Nazis did. They started to condemn the Nazis as well as to tell the truth about Hitler's lies. They also talked about the mass murder of Jews that the Nazis committed. Actually, they called this mass murder the most frightful crime the Nazis ever committed. Beyond the leaflets, they also painted slogans in and around Munich. Things such as "Mass Murder Hitler" were often seen in the city. Also here in front of the entrance of the university, they painted slogans such as "Freedom" or "Down with Hitler." Even though the authorities started to clean those paintings and slogans, the White Rose constantly repainted them. It was also here at the university on February 18, 1943, that the White Rose movement came to an end. Sophie and Hans Scholl came here with a suitcase full of leaflets. It was the 6th leaflet. It was addressed directly to the students, and it was inspired by their philosophy professor Huber. It was lecture time, and the hallways were basically empty. Hans and Sophie placed stacks of those leaflets in those hallways of the university. But there were some extras left, and in a bold move, Sophie opened up a window and threw the stack of extra leaflets out of the window into the atrium of the university. But this action was seen by the janitor Jakob Schmidt. He was loyal to the Nazi party, and therefore he detained Hans and Sophie Schmidt until the Gestapo arrived. The siblings were taken to the Gestapo headquarters where they were interrogated for various days. At the beginning, both denied everything, but once they were confronted with proof that it was found on Hans, as well as Hans's confession to protect others, Sophie too decided to confess. Her interrogator gave her the opportunity to blame her brother and to distance herself from the leaflets. However, she decided to not do so. Once again, she stood up for her own values and beliefs. She even said someone, in the end, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is believed by many others. With that confession, there was no mercy anymore. Only 4 days after their confession, on February 22nd, 1943, Sophie and Hans Scholz, as well as Christoph Probst, were facing their trial here in the Palace of Justice. The so-called blood judge was flown in from Berlin specifically for their trial, which was essentially a show trial. Despite Hans's plea to save Christoph, who had a wife and 3 children, the verdict was quick and swift. They were accused of treason and punished with death.
The regime thought silencing them would erase their message, but the opposite happened. The White Rose's final leaflet was smuggled out of Germany and eventually dropped by Allied planes over German cities, sharing their message of resistance with millions. Their story gained international recognition, becoming a symbol of courage against tyranny.
The White Rose isn't just history. It reminds us of how important it is to speak up for your beliefs. These weren't superheroes. They were normal human beings, young people, students that felt the strong moral obligation to speak up for their values and to speak up for others because they've seen how much wrong there was here in Germany. They spoke up for those that couldn't or that didn't have the power to do so, and they did it even though it had cost them everything.
Munich was where the darkness began, but it was also where sparks of light refused to be extinguished. In lecture halls, in cellars, and in silence, ordinary people chose courage over fear. In remembering them, we not only honor their sacrifice, we learn what it truly means to resist.